Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the joint webinar series between the Milken Institute and Inquire AI. My name is Matthew Shapiro, and I'm the head of strategic partnerships at Inquire. Today's discussion will be exploring supply chain innovation. We used Inquire AI's Pulse platform to generate unique insights from our global network of experts in and around the supply chain industry to steer today's conversation. And I'm very pleased to welcome back our moderator for today and Inquire Advisory Board member, Terry McBride, who will briefly introduce today's speakers from Brace Associates and the Milken Institute. Terry, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate it. I'm delighted to be here. I'm also pleased to introduce Richard Brattle from Brace Associates and also a member of Inquire AI's expert network, also formerly with Siemens and Rolls-Royce, and Kevin Clouden, Executive Director for the Center for Regional Economics at the Milken Institute. Richard, if you'd like to start with more detailed self-introduction, please.
Yes, certainly. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. So my name is Richard Brattle. So I work for Brace Associates. We're a consultancy firm focused on helping specifically SMEs with regards to improving how they're doing their supply chain activities. So be that category management, supply relationship management, or risk management. As I've just introduced, my background is with large OEMs, Siemens and Rolls-Royce, in the oil and gas, power gen, and aerospace industries. My last role was head of supply chain management and category management for Siemens Large Machining and head of SCM for the aeroderivative gas turbine.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Kevin?
Hi, my name is Kevin Clouden. Actually, my official title got tweaked recently between when this was announced and now, so it's officially Chief Global Strategist for the Milken Institute. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit economic think tank who's been thrilled to partner with Inquire AI on these programming. I'm actually based in Los Angeles, but we have offices in New York, Washington, London, and Singapore, as well as a smaller office in Abu Dhabi. And my background is particularly focused on regional economics and economic competitiveness and issues of trade and exports and capital access. I have been chair of the Trade Finance Advisory Council for the U.S. Department of Commerce for the last 5 years, as well as having served in a number of advisory roles for the state of California, city of Los Angeles, federal government, as well as a number of international institutions and issues of trade, trade modernization, exports, and issues of trade finance.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And let me say, I'm delighted to have both of you join us today. And in our pre-briefing, we had a very robust discussion. And I think today's session is going to be incredibly interesting. As we discussed, one of the things we did is we asked a number of questions to our expert network panel. And one interesting that came out was a robust variety of answers. So in these network pulse questions, let me pull up just a couple of them and I'll tee us up for part of the discussion. What are the most interesting digital innovations driving greater supply chain efficiency at the moment? That's one I'd like to discuss. And then the other one that I think is particularly relevant right now, what are some of the top relevant geopolitical risks that we're experiencing right now vis-a-vis supply chain? So Kevin, if you could start with the digital innovation, I'd appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, the single biggest area of digital innovation is actually in the digitization of processes. One of the things that people tend not to recognize or realize unless you're on the ground is the sheer amount of physical paperwork that is still required. Physical copies of documentation, physical copies for letters of credit, for various issues in terms of this. And the supply chains can often be held up by countries not being able to adapt and process, let alone companies. One of the key things that I've been very engaged in, very much want to push forward, issues such as legal entity identifiers as an internationally acceptable standard, with the idea that if companies actually have a standardized digital identifier, and if they have digital interfaces, that it opens up a tremendous number of different areas in ways to speed up processes, as well as access issues of digital finance. And one of the things that we're very aware of is that depending on the measures and who you talk to, you can have, there's over $1 trillion gap in trade finance. And one of the major tools that's available and to effectively bridge that is by using by using electronic and digital financing, issues of various blockchain tools, fintech, financial technology tools, and being able to have the companies access that with a clear digital standardization and digital presence can make a huge difference in terms of who's able to participate and, quite honestly, how quickly, because the system gets broken down when companies can't access the funding, and especially if they go through and are stuck for hours, days, or weeks for the products to move through because of reliance on traditional physical printed documentation.
Thank you, Kevin. I find that interesting. It sounds like such a foundational, let me say, obstacle. Richard, do you agree with that, or what else would you add for digital innovation?
Well, I think the addition I would add is digital innovation, digitalization is a super hot topic at the moment. It's especially been accelerated the last 2 years. I think I see a number of companies jumping on that without actually doing the due diligence to actually really understand what it is that they actually want to achieve, what it is that business, what is their business model. And very often organizations will deploy a digital robot, digital innovations, and they just won't get the level of benefit they're expecting. So I think sometimes you've got to take a step back and say, what are we actually trying to achieve? What's the process we're trying to streamline? What are the areas of work which we're trying to remove? And really focus on that. So that's kind of one area, which I don't see companies doing enough. You need to really have a strategic approach to doing it, and that will also minimize your stack cost as well. But once you've actually understood that and you're doing that, I see two ways to help at the moment. The first one is digital tools which can actually help with minimizing the transactional workload. That gives your teams the opportunity to focus on the more strategic activities. And there's a plethora of tools out there that can do automated tech pack creations, for example. You can actually have Core AI, for example, is one company that helps with this. Siemens also has something called Paula, where you can actually write in there as a buyer, create a tech pack, or go ahead and create a purchase order report. That will do all that work for you. And then based off that, they can focus on actually working with the vendor to improve their performance. And then there's other digital tools which are available, which will actually help you with regards to understanding the data that's out there. So there are tools we see associated with helping on risk management. If you've got all of your suppliers loaded correctly, it will make it very clear if there's a supplier in a geographic location where there's risks. Also, you can actually have tools such as Lotus Analytics, which will actually review and crawl the data and provide analytics on where you see inflation risks, where there's opportunity to reduce cost. So, for me, it's immensely interesting. It's all around, in my perspective, data and how you can utilize that data, but you've really got to get the basics put in first. Why are you doing it? And also, do you have a quality data set to start with? I was having a conversation a few weeks back about a category management tool on AI, for example. They actually have an AI module to that, which will actually help give you recommendations on what would be your category management approach, which is excellent. But if you wanted to embed that in a company and you haven't in your ERP system got a category management structure, it won't work. So if you don't have the right data coming in, then the output won't be optimal. So there's several steps I think that need to be taken prior to really doing that digital journey.
I think you've raised an interesting point, both of you. And let's just even start at the very beginning, because right now there's so much interest in supply chain innovation. If you had even told me 5 years ago that there would be so much interest in supply chain, I probably would have been a little surprised. So when we think about supply chain, what are we actually dealing with? Let's say when the average consumer thinks about supply chain, what should we be worried about? When a professional thinks about supply chain, what are those issues that are top of mind? And Kevin, do you want to start?
Well, sure. I think, forgive me for using a very obvious example, but I think that looking at Britain in the post-Brexit world is a great way for customers and people to understand that. Your average business or consumer around the world first noticed everything at the beginning of the pandemic, when suddenly items that we expected to be available on demand suddenly weren't, such as toilet paper, such as masks, such as gloves, such as various things that you need for hospitals, various basic things you felt like you needed for home. Why? Because they were going to the wrong places. In Britain, what you did is you had everything magnified, because what is a key to a supply chain is predictability. That if you are going to have your business run and operate, if you are going to go to the market and go for your weekly purchases, you expect things to be there in a consistent, regular way. And what we don't think about is that we've moved towards efficiencies all around the world. We've gone and we've moved manufacturing, not just of assembly, but also of various specialized components, of various consumer goods. All of this has all gone to places where up to 2020, and even a bit before then, we expected that it would be the best cost and, in theory, low risk. And what we realize in terms of the way supply chains work, and they affect all of us, is that when you have a computer, your computer is often assembled in one country, even if it's all in the same country, that it will still be a case where the chassis and everything's put together in one country or one location. The chips are made somewhere else. The hard drives are made somewhere else. The memory is made somewhere else. The software is provided by somewhere else. And all of it is assembled into one key piece that is then made on offer, is sold to you, and has to be shipped to you. And if all of that breaks down, any of it breaks down, suddenly it's not available. And what we've seen with, if you're in a country like Britain, where you relied on a network of suppliers and a network of distributors and a network of manufacturers who all operated on what had been the evolving European Union rules for decades, and then suddenly that moves away, you then have to assess, well, what about the rules and the paperwork? How do you get things through customs where there used to be customs, and you separate your supplier and your subler and your distributor? What happens when you have something even that's a raw good that you want to bring in, and like, let's say you have some tomatoes, let's say you have some some cheeses, and you have it in to go into your final food product that you manufacture in the UK, and then you turn around and export it back to the continent. Well, if your suppliers happen to be somewhere else,
you're raising a really interesting point that I'd like to come back to, about the difference between, let's say, just in time and just in case. But if we go back to even the more basic idea of, when we think about supply chain, what is the average consumer really concerned about? And when we think about it from a business perspective, what is that top of mind risk that business should be concerned about? Disruption.
The very first thing should be, it's not there. If you're a customer, you're worried that the product that you ordered or the product that you expect for your life is not in the store, or isn't able to get shipped to you, and doesn't come in when you want it or need it. Medicine being the most extreme example in many ways, or food. And if you're a business, you're worried about what makes your business operate. You worry about getting the pieces together that makes your product possible, and you worry about getting that product to the end customer. What happens if if that takes too long, or that's not possible? What happens in terms of your cash flow for your business? And all of that suddenly becomes questioned. And if you don't have predictability, then everything becomes a question and a major concern.
Great. Richard, what's your response to that?
So I definitely think I don't disagree. I mean, fundamentally, all the points are completely, I'm aligned with. I think I would just kind of maybe come at it a very slightly different perspective, and that is the fact that as a procurement person, to me, it's cost, quality, and delivery. And I think that completely translates to the consumer. If you're looking to, and also I agree with you, no one used to speak to me about supply chain outside of work. Now everyone's asking questions about what's happening. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, for example, any consumer right now, whatever good it is they're procuring, be it an individual buying what they want from Amazon, or be it another business buying a component required for an aircraft, for example, they're looking for the same things. Is it at the cost I'm expecting it to be? We've all seen what's happened just recently with inflation, with all supply chain bottlenecks. The costs are going up. Why is that? That's the impact of supply chain. In terms of quality, just recently, all the situation we've had with the COVID inoculations, certainly in the UK, some of those had to be maintained at a certain temperature. Well, when they're arriving at the pharmacies, for example, in the UK, sticking to the UK example, pharmacies at the end of the day were literally having to throw some of these inoculations away where people needed them, and they were being thrown away because they weren't being maintained at a certain temperature. Now, the NHS and the partners in the UK did a fantastic job at trying to minimize that wastage, but that is supply chain. And then delivery, we've all experienced that at the moment. When you're trying to buy for Christmas, or you're trying to buy the latest toy and nothing was available. I tried to buy some weights at the height of the pandemic, and it was, I think, 5.5 months for me to get some weights, which was my excuse for putting on weight. But I mean, fundamentally for me, that is the supply chain. And then when you dig deeper into that, it's the fact that I just don't think people, and I think people are now realizing it more and more and more, how complex it is, the fact that you don't just ask for something and it arrives, how deep those supply chains go and how fragmented they can be. And as you go further down those tiers, how actually you can end up multiple companies buying from that same company further down the line. I think people are realizing that with the semiconductor industry, all the problems we've seen recently with in automation. So
that's interesting. So let's come back to the question about just in time to just in case. And then what does this look like in the situation of rising interest rates and rising commodity prices?
Yeah. Okay. So for me, so for me at the moment, I'm certainly seeing that. So it's historically, there's been a lot of pressure to have a just-in-time type operation. So therefore, I've had multiple conversations with CFOs who are trying to drive inventory down further and further and further. So it's absolutely lean. That's obviously great for cash flow. Now, there's certainly, I'm seeing a shift where people are realizing, okay, we need to maintain inventory. We need to have a, and I think that's kind of getting closer to the second element of the question here. Inventory is good. It's good to have a certain degree of inventory to make sure you can actually deliver, because if you don't have the inventory to make a key component, then that can blow out any of your costs that you may have saved by having a just-in-time or making sure your inventory is lean. So certainly we're seeing that. But what I've also seen in companies, including my old companies, is the fact that you can have inventory, but have you got the right inventory? With the amount of conversations I've had is, oh, we have 150 million, $200 million worth of inventory. It's not the right inventory. It's either obsolete, it's used on different product. So for me, and that kind of comes back to some of the innovation element on the first one, is have we got that right level of analytics? Do you really understand what is the inventory you need, what the turns are on those specific elements, and making sure you've got those right levels? So that S&OP process, having the analytics associated with that, there are tools, AI tools can help with that. But that for me is absolutely critical, because as we go forward, the cost of capital is going to increase. You're also seeing the fact that raw material prices, they're still high. Inflation is occurring. I would never predict when I see that coming back down again, or when that's going to have some normalcy. But you always do have that risk that if you build up inventory, it's going to be that really expensive inventory. So you want to keep it lean, just in case the spot rates come down. So I think it's a very complex question. I think it depends on the market you're in, depends on what commodities you're buying.
So great. Thank you, Richard. Kevin, I can see you both nodding your head, and it looks like you have something to add. What would you add to that?
Well, I think actually Richard raises a great point, which is that understanding the products that you have to have just in case, that this is a huge issue. We tend to see it most often reflected in retail, because you see a failure to understand the data and to analyze. And so you wind up with a number of companies very notoriously holding a lot of inventory. One of the things that, just to show you, particularly in retail where that mismatch exists, is that you have whole companies that entirely exist based on the idea that they can go and buy the essentially the inventory that has been mismanaged at larger retail operators. That you have that, and this isn't just true with clothing, which is notorious, but this can be true with automobiles. This can be true with computers. This can be true all around. This can be in the business sector, let alone into the consumer sector. And that problem that a lot of businesses tried to solve leading up to the pandemic by just going ultra lean, that you were trying to do everything where you didn't want your inventory, not only you dealing with the fact that you're worried about cash flow and you're worried about being able to respond quickly, but when you thought you had predictability in terms of your manufacturing, you thought you could shift resources and that you didn't have to worry about commodity pricing in the same way. You didn't have to worry about all of that, that you could be nimble. But now, and one of the things you have to add in terms of risk on top of everything else is geopolitical disruptions. What if you have that inventory and it's not able to get to its end destination? And so it becomes down now to analyzing and saying, do you have the right inventory? Do you have it in your right distribution center? Do you have the right setup? Do you have redundancies built in? And if you don't have those, well, it becomes a lot scarier, a lot faster.
So if we take this into account, how do you think this will impact any nearshoring trends? And if you think nearshoring is going to increase, what do you think will be the next attractive supply chain hubs and why?
Do you want me to take a shot on that first, Richard? Or do you want to go ahead?
Either one, no problem.
All right. I'll tell you what, I think that the first thing to recognize with nearshoring is that there's a limit. Whenever you hear a lot of political discussions about bringing manufacturing home to different countries, especially in the United States, a lot of the discussions about the USMCA, the modernized NAFTA agreement, was about trying to nearshore a lot of supply chains, nearshore a lot of manufacturing back to the States. And there's just a limit. There's a limit in terms of cost. There's a limit in terms of available workers, how long it takes to build a factory, how long it takes to build a distribution, and so on. But what I think you'll see more of, and I think you'll see around this globally, not just in North America, is having more regional strategies, recognizing that things can blow up on a worldwide basis, and there can be problems. So do you have a regional analysis of what the demand is and the supply is, a regional inventory, often regional manufacturers or suppliers, so that if things go badly, if you have a dependency on Ukrainian suppliers and they're suddenly gone, do you have the ability to adapt? And that is going to be part of a strategy, I think, for companies everywhere, not just in North America.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Richard, what's your response to that?
Yeah, so we talked about this one briefly before. I mean, I honestly think that nearshoring for me is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. I've seen nearshoring and onshoring being discussed at great depth. Frankly, I think, in my previous role at Rolls-Royce and at Siemens, I actually ran the transfer team for the industrial gas turbine division. So that's basically where you move from this supplier to this supplier. So making a decision to say, hey, let's move from this supplier to this supplier, it sounds easy. It's not easy at all. Depending on which particular type of component you're using, it can take months. And frankly, when you come to some really complex critical components, I've got some stories where it's taken years and is still ongoing, where you have non-conformances and all this kind of stuff from the new vendor. So I would say, firstly, it's not as easy as people think. Even if you actually can find suppliers in a region that are able to do that, because then that's the other thing. I mean, there's for the last 30 odd years plus, there has been moving product out to the Far East, for example, China specifically. That's taken a long time to happen. When you try and bring product back near shore or even onshore, is there the capability for companies to actually make those products in those areas? That's question one. Probably there is, but in some really niche areas, maybe there's not. Then there's the availability of people. Right now, most of the people most of the companies I'm talking with at the moment, they are struggling to get skilled labor. So therefore, when you bring that in, there's going to be a ramp up associated with doing that. And fundamentally, I think it really does come down to the category strategy. The commodity managers, the strategic procurement team need to do that analysis to say which are the key commodities that make sense to move in a nearshore area. Personally, I think dual sourcing is something you're going to see more of, and multi-sourcing. That obviously does fragment the supply chain. It does potentially reduce the leverage to actually reduce cost, but it helps you with your supply chain resiliency. So, and that for me is the key thing there. And I think Kevin, you kind of infer on that as well, is having that resilient supply chain. If you can have this regional approach where you have a supplier in the Americas, you have a supplier in Europe, where you've actually got the ability to benefit from the lower cost potentially with hourly rate arbitrage, and having one on that same geographical location, I think that's where you're kind of trying to balance the approach, balance the risk, and balance the economic viability. Because if you move everything, not saying you would, but just as an extreme example, you move everything from, say, China and you move it to, let's say, Mexico or Canada, doing nearshoring, or US for onshoring, using US as an example, and your competitors continue to use Eastern Europe or China or other areas where they've got a lower cost, then there's the potential that you're not going to be competitive going forward. But there was a recent, but it is happening. There's no debate about it. There was a recent questionnaire done by Bernstein in 2020. 40% of SCM, so supply chain managers, were saying they are looking at regionalizations. That's specifically, Kevin, to your point. And 1 year later, apparently, 25% have done it. So it certainly is happening, but I think it needs to be strategic, considered, done for the right categories, because it is expensive. It does cost money. There can be some great competitive advantages afterwards, but it will take time to actually do it. And I just think it needs to be considered. People shouldn't just automatically go ahead and run and do it.
Great, thank you. I want to encourage all of our listeners to put any questions you may have in our Q&A at the bottom of the screen. I did want to pick up both the difference between skilled and unskilled labor and the demand for that. But before we go to that question, I did want to pick up the question of how will supply chains change, specifically vis-a-vis quality control? And what is the challenge with ESG, specifically labeling who is good in a chain? And Kevin, if you could pick that up, that would be helpful.
Well, I think there are a couple different things that you're going on here. I think in terms of quality, one of the major issues you run into, I mean, this goes also into what Richard's saying about the cost of regionalization, is that every time that you proceed to go and develop either a redundancy or a secondary line or a regionalization, you have to go through teething process. You have to go through evaluating your potential partners. You have to go through analyzing what are the risks and the rewards, and quality is a significant factor. And quality is an issue that's not just an issue, say, of manufacturing or of programming or of labor. It can be an issue as well in terms of what happens in terms of rule of law and delays and unpredictabilities and various things that, all of which can add to a disruption or create a problem for your product. And that is something that consistently is a concern. And it becomes a trade-off between, expediting the process. You can find there are countries where you can go in and that issue of skilled versus unskilled labor. But just going in quickly and being able to add a new line or anything like that. But what do you do if you risk your reputation? What do you do if you create a risk for your entire line? And that's a really significant concern in terms of that. And I'm going down the road on that. Your second half of your question. Right.
Great, thank you. Richard, what's your response to this in terms of these good countries and making sure that we're adhering to any ESG standards?
Okay, well, yeah, firstly, on the quality side of things, agree. I think it's product quality that you get as a consumer, but then you've got quality that leaves the company. You've also got the quality of the processes. I mean, that's the area that people often forget, the fact that if the process control is subpar, it's not adequate, you might have product coming off which is great for 3-4 months, and then all of a sudden something happens, it fails. That could be an issue with the process internally. So quality really is not just product quality, it's process quality that lies into the actual process, and also training of the people, which to me is quality in terms of training and capability. So just on the quality side, but agree with the comments. On ESG, I find ESG, I mean, that's a huge topic right now. Again, interesting. Well, let me start. One, I don't think we're doing enough. I would say that as a starter for 10, quite frankly, in terms of ESG. At the moment, if you look in supply chain, so for any kind of company, their suppliers are what's called scope 3. Scope 3 is anywhere between 70 and 80% of CO2 emissions. I mean, that's specifically for kind of CO2. And you know, our company's doing it. There are some absolute kind of fantastic companies out there who are really demonstrating they're doing the right thing, that they're starting to go through the different tiers of the supply chain. But when I speak to a lot of companies, even major OEMs, and you speak to their procurement organizations and you say to them, okay, what are you being measured on? Cost. Low cost country sourcing is a big one, and some other things. So I do see that the ESG element is, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on this, so please control it, but it's a huge topic. I don't think we're doing enough of it. I also think it's massively complex. Getting the transparency in order to actually understand how a supply chain is scoring from an ESG perspective is difficult, because you've got to go down not just the prime, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. You can be going all the way down the supply chain. I do, however, think that there will be an impact with regards to the previous conversation we had around nearshoring there, because obviously when you start having product moving all around the globe, there is a ESG impact associated with that. So I recall one component that we had manufactured in Canada, it went Canada, US, across the border 13 times. So just from an ESG perspective, that's kind of crazy. That also comes back to the quality of the process that we were talking about earlier on as well.
You're making an interesting distinction about quality of process. We do have a question about how do third world countries develop their supply chain strategies? I'm hearing a distinction about the maturation of supply chain processes. So whether third world country or not, how would one develop the supply chain strategy?
Okay, so if you were doing a supply chain strategy, so we'll start with as a category strategy. The first thing I would try and identify here is, what are the requirements? So as a business, what are you actually trying to achieve? What are you making within that business? I mean, the key thing with the supply chain, I think the importance, we opened it up at the beginning of the conversation now, is they're not just the people buying stuff that has to come in. It's a fundamental part of the business. You can have, I mean, the companies I've worked for now, easily 70% of products actually procured versus what's actually made in-house, and it can be a lot higher than that. Many companies, it's 100%. So you need to understand what are the requirements from engineering, from project management, from sales. You need to collate all those requirements. Once you've understood where you want to be.
Let me stop you there. Is this going to drive a need for greater interchangeability, so I can flip out one generic for another in the supply chain? Is that one of the end results?
Absolutely could be, yeah. So one of the requirements could be, instead of having a specific specification, we say we would like to have a generic spec, for example. So it doesn't tie you to one company or to one spec, so you can actually have interchangeability in the product design, 100%. So that could be.
Kevin, what's your response to that? Is this a good thing? Or to go back to the question about product quality, does this drive down product quality because we no longer have branded, reputable goods and we just have generic goods?
Well, it can potentially, I mean, there are a few different factors in play. The first is, and go back to what I mentioned before about, starting up a new line, a new supplier, a new anything, you have to be able to rely on them and vet them. It becomes, the concern is that if there's a disruption, that it goes all the way down in terms of that, if you have something generic, there are generics that are excellent, they're amazing, but you're putting your own reputation and linking it to that whatever gets swapped in. And because in the end, one of the things that they did, a lot of market analysis has determined, is that when you talk about that issue of brand recognition and reliability, perceptions vary from country to country. Perceptions vary not just on brands, they vary on the origin of the product, both in terms of where it's manufactured and where they associate it with and the kind of items connected to it. And that can create a whole significant number of effects. I mean, I over the years, I've talked with Chinese officials in both government and private sector who lamented the fact that products get made by an American company or a German company, or where they're assembled in China, but nobody really thinks about that reflecting Chinese quality. It reflects the identity of that larger brand. And if you think about the fact that, just as an example, Apple, where they market fundamentally under this designed in California label, because they know that overrides a lot of the considerations. It's not just made in China. Where in China are the different assembly plants are? Where are the different issues? I mean, worth remembering years ago, and actually more than once, that Apple has had to deal with very significant ESG concerns in terms of their suppliers. And so how do they overcome that? And when they cover that every time, if the suppliers become interchangeable, you run that risk over and over again. And so for a developing world country who's trying to break in, part of the issue you have is that you're trying to sell your own reputation or the reputation of your suppliers or your companies to get into the supply chain. And if you're trying to create a wholly new product and push it in, you need to figure out a way that makes it viewed as either innovative enough or interesting enough or different enough, not just low cost enough, that it allows you to break into the space and to overcome some of the perceived risk issues that are otherwise inherent.
Great, thank you. Richard, I saw you nodding when we were talking about the perceived branding of where products actually come from. How does this resonate with you?
I was kind of laughing because we had, I've got two examples. We had one is an offload from a manufacturing, an OEM's internal factory, who was obviously making the product. We offloaded that to a factory in China, and that product then obviously comes back to be assembled into the end product. And the amount of resistance to that, predominantly because of quality concerns, was raised. And I just laugh because when the product actually came into the factory, the guys who were actually working on it on the floor, apart from the paperwork and the part number, couldn't tell the difference. It was that good. And this is the thing. I mean, you know, China's obviously getting more. I'm just using China as an example, right? China, what was it? 2003 or something, it was like 21 times cheaper than the US. Now it's 4.3 times cheaper than the US. So yeah, it's gotten significantly more comparatively. The arbitrage is gone. So maybe the low complex product, you can go elsewhere. But honestly, the product you can get out of China is as good a quality, in my opinion, as you can get anywhere else. And this is the same for a lot of these other regions. So what I would say, and the second example I had as well, is that there was this misunderstanding. It was in conversation with another OEM that's actually splitting right now. And they were saying, look, when you're offloading product out of a factory into external suppliers, you know, suppliers can't take this on, surely. And the factory, the operations guys say, no, they can't. We've got to keep it in-house. And then there's a degree of, you know, protecting what you have there. But honestly, I think you can pretty much get anything externally. And there's IP concerns, and I've heard IP concerns raised a lot of times as well. And someone says, I mean, one great example is turbine blades and vanes, fan blades, you know, certain elements where you've got, you know, very, very complex IP built in, and they see that as a differentiator for their product. Yeah, you go to an air show or you go to certain regions and you can see there's turbine blades, there's other components there being manufactured by these other companies, and they're working. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities out there. And specifically, you know, same comment here is countries that are trying to get, developing countries that are trying to get into those spaces. The way I would be doing that, and it comes back to the first element I was saying, because you asked me, how would you put together a supplier strategy, for for example. It's get those requirements, understand those requirements. A purchaser would then say, okay, now I understand those requirements. Where are we now? Where do you want to get to? And the strategy is just as simple as what are the steps required to get to where you need to get to. If you're a supplier, a company, or even the country who wants to penetrate a certain market, I would start getting and having conversations with those OEMs, with the category managers, with the supply chain guys, and say, look, what is it that you're interested in? What is it that you want? And so they can start demonstrating that capability, get a few pilot customers, demonstrate the complexity they can make, and that the quality is as good, if not better, than some of the traditional countries. That's what I've seen really successful suppliers do, because they'll contact me and say, hey, look, we've got this capability. I'm like, wow, I didn't know they had that capability in this particular country. Then you see it, and that's how they start getting in and getting on the category strategies, because a lot of these larger companies, less for the SMEs, but for those larger companies, on a given commodity, they'll have a matrix which says these are kind of new entrants, current entrants, exit, maintain. And you want to get on that new entrant area, because sometimes you're going to struggle to even have a conversation with a buyer if you don't get on that strategy. So I would start reaching out to them, air shows, emails, etc., trying to introduce that capability and also understand the requirements.
That's very, very helpful. With the topic of China, I feel like we could have a very long discussion just on this. But what are the industries that are most susceptible to Chinese-US geopolitical risk? What are your predictions?
Well, the first one I think is technology. I think it's it's a generic thing, but I think that anything that moves in a higher technology component becomes a significant issue. But first, we talk about, if you want to expand it again, but if you want to talk about semiconductors, the fact that semiconductors are fundamental to not only what we consider to be things like computers and radar, but they're everywhere. You have semiconductor products not just in your phones, not just in your cars, but often in your home appliances and in your water meters and in your various in things that affect everywhere and everything. And that becomes the biggest concern, because not only are semiconductors mostly and very heavily made in China, they're also heavily controlled by Taiwanese companies. And so you have that double whammy of both of the Taiwan relationship with mainland China, but also with the concerns that go on there between those fundamental high technology components, the concerns about intellectual property, the concerns about the geopolitical risk between them. And if you want an example of just how important that relationship is, look at the Russian military and look at a lot of Russian industries. So Russia, after 2014, after annexing Crimea, got cut off, not just from Western suppliers, but also from Chinese suppliers who were concerned about winding up on a blacklist or winding up in being caught in the middle of this relationship. So even now you have real issues where Chinese companies who are still trying to sell to Russia are very, very careful about what technology or what things they're willing to move. That relationship between the US and China affects everybody else in the world. So if that, especially when it comes to various issues of high technology, and we see it with Huawei, we see it with, we see this with cars, we see it with computers, all of that. And so if that becomes at risk, you're just going to see it cascading around a number of other areas.
Great, thank you. Richard, what would you add to that, please?
Yeah, I think the only couple of additions I would add is certainly high tech. So in terms of, you mentioned industries, so things like aerospace for sure, and you especially with that, I find the export control requirements that there are right now really do make it very difficult associated with certain technologies. For example, anytime you talk about things like combustion system, hot blades and vanes, hot section of an engine as an example, that makes, there are certain restrictions associated with using certain countries, China being one. I do recall many debates when we're trying to look at certain commodities going to certain countries, China specifically, where export control would be like, oh, okay, hang on, what specifically is it you're looking to do this for? And there's a lot of depending on what industry you're in, there's some components which have got a civil application but also have a military application. Second, you've got dual usage associated with certain products, then that's going to be really problematic. So yeah, I certainly think anything high tech, as Kevin's saying, certainly aerospace, power gen, there's going to be some considerations there. Although it's interesting, when you look at when I look at CapEx, I think I saw recently that China is still accounting for over 40, up to kind of 60% of the CapEx for industries, which include your motor vehicles, basic pharma, general manufacturing, and your electronics. So despite the considerations around that, there's a huge amount of growth that's still happening in China. No one's running away right now. There's still lots of things happening, and they're getting more and more high tech product, which is an interesting one for me because there is concerns about the IP, and yet we see more and more growth happening in that area, certainly in capex. So I mean, they're 15.4% of world trade export right now, so it's significant.
Helpful. We have an interesting question from one of our participants. So very specifically, how should a CFO react to the changing supply chain landscape? Because we're looking at this from a procurement perspective, but recognizing that there are a lot of changes that need to be managed and short-term and long-term forecasting. And you can see my cat in the back of my screen, so apologies for that. But what advice would you give for the CFO?
So on that one, I'll say right now, I would say the CFO needs to be a little bit more comfortable with the massive amount of ambiguity that there is right now. That means that they're going to need to also think about things such as additional inventory. Unfortunately, is something they're going to have to have, but again, it's the right type of inventory. I also think that in the past, you've historically been able to put in place long-term multi-year agreements with suppliers, which depending on how much leverage and power you have as a buyer, you'd actually be able to have fixed price contracts. If you don't have quite as much leverage, or just because it's, for whatever reason, you end up putting escalation or de-escalation clauses in there, that's when you might, and depending again how much transparency you can get, you might actually say, okay, SG&A, for example, will have this index managing it. You might have specific raw material indices associated with that. Some suppliers right now are refusing to do contracts. They just won't do any long-term agreements right now. So therefore, again, you have that ambiguity. Whereas historically, if you can put a contract in place, you've got that forecastability. You've got the reliability there. And a CFO will be kind of comfortable with that. So I think that's certainly one area. I also think they specifically need to, if they don't already, understand raw materials a bit more, and the input and the fluctuations that are happening with raw materials, because people keep asking when a raw material price is going to go back down to normalcy. No idea. I think if anyone says they know the answer to that, they're telling a porcupine. And all I will say is that I certainly think it's going to go down. But if you look at all the historic trend charts, even pre-COVID, they were always trending long-term kind of upwards. So I think they're the key things I would initially say to CFO. Get more comfortable with the ambiguity. There's going to be ups and downs. Some of the controls, like doing long-term agreements, are harder to put in place. Suppliers are less willing to go further into the future because they just don't know what's going to happen. I guess the only other final one I'll say is that internal costs, they're high. Still, a lot of companies are struggling to get resources. By that I mean capital, by people, beg your pardon. I was in conversation just recently, machinists on the shop floor getting over $30 US an hour. That's a lot of money. So expect for there to be higher costs on hourly wage and certainly on utilities, unless you come to Canada and generate a benefit from hydro.
and thank you for that plug. Appreciate it. So Kevin, what advice would you give for a CFO?
Well, I think that Richard said a lot of it. I think it comes down to this distinguishing of reassessing short-term and long-term risk. A lot of this is recognizing that it's hard to do, as Richard said, to lock in the long-term contracts, because long-term contracts require your suppliers and your various others to have predictability themselves. And if they don't have it, how are they going to share it with you? And so recognizing that this exposure to risk is all the way up and down the supply chain is very, very important. And then the next is realizing that risk mitigation strategies, and unfortunately, as we've been talking about during this entire time, they're not cheap. You have to, you're basically foregoing a certain amount of short-term profits, unless you happen to be one of those lucky commodity suppliers or somebody who is just in a position where your product is suddenly dramatically in demand and you don't see the end of it. And even there are concerns about it. You have to balance things out. But even if you look at somebody like the oil companies, all the oil companies, part of the driving factor here is that having been so thoroughly burned when oil prices bottomed out a couple different times, when petroleum prices went down, including at the beginning of the pandemic, where it was actually people were running out of space to store various extracted oil. They're all worried about making these long-term investments, and with everybody afraid of long-term infrastructure investments, long-term structural ones, you have to recognize that you need to do a balancing act, and that means not cutting your inventory to bare bones because then you're overly exposed, but also it means not over heavily investing in misreading the market. And if a CFO needs to be able to have somebody in their company enough that they trust to fill in those gaps in terms of recognizing and reading where the opportunities are and where the trends are, because there has to be an investment. There has to be an investment in adequate product. There has to be investment in adequate risk mitigation, whether it is regional near sourcing, whether it is redundant suppliers, whether it is looking at different potentials in terms of commodities, but not doing it so badly that you make your product too expensive to survive in the market. It's not simple. I wish it were, but CFOs are having a harder time in many ways right now than anybody else because they're the ones who have to see that picture.
Agreed. I have two questions. One's very broad, and then one is incredibly specific. Let's start with the broad one. What do you see the impact of supply chain disruption on both skilled and unskilled labor? That's the very first question. But then the second question I want to make sure that we have time for is, what innovations do you see coming along in last mile delivery? So let's start with the very broad one about both skilled and unskilled labor.
Well, skilled labor is definitely at a premium, I think, but part of it is assessing what do we consider skilled labor. Richard makes a comment about machinists and machinists getting higher wages. It's realizing that what we think of and what we really need to consider as being the skills that are in demand and the skills that will be in demand and there's a mismatch there. And that is there's a mismatch whenever you go into a new area, a new country. There's a mismatch even in some of the when you want nearshoring, you realize that nobody's been training or hiring people for a number of these positions that you want to bring back. And that needs to be assessed. So a lot of it is going to be recognizing where this need is, where this demand is, and matching it, and recognizing that in theory, unskilled labor can go anywhere. And the problem is that it's not always really simply unskilled labor. It's the semi-skilled, it's the getting people who know how to operate the processes, the people who can create reliability, and knowing that this isn't just a matter of pulling somebody in off the street, and that it takes that assessment. And I think that those opportunities, and there are going to be wage pressures, and I think part of the problem we have worldwide right now in the market is that the jobs that don't require skills, the working conditions aren't commensurate with wages in a high inflation environment, and the ones where those skills are needed, we haven't aligned training very often in large chunks of the world with where the demand actually is.
Great. Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think what's happened as well recently is if you look in the last 2 years, what did a lot of companies do? They offered redundancies, they offered early retirement packages. in the last 2 years. A lot of people took those. Obviously, that was really great at that point in time for a lot of these organizations, but now as they ramp up or as they need to actually bring back certain labor, there's a huge skills gap. You've got all these people because very often it tends to be people who are highly, very, very skilled, who say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna take that early retirement, or I'm gonna take that redundancy package. And then when you try and fulfill them, these skilled labor elements, it doesn't take 5 to 10 minutes to get people up to that level. It takes a lot of time. So I think that's going to be a major issue. So I think companies, when they're looking to invest, if they're going to open up a new factory, if they're going to do this or they can do that, I think you're going to hear the availability of good quality resource pools is going to be a determining factor in which location certain companies will open. So for example, do you open in a region where you've got loads of other major OEMs, or do you open up a factory in a place that, I don't know, slightly more rural area where you've got more of a pick of the resources that are going to be available? I honestly think that's going to be a big conversation in the coming years as people realize how big that resource hole basically is. And yeah, on the unskilled and skilled, I agree. Manufacturing machinists, I mean, skilled machinists, that it's immensely skilled. Welders, immensely skilled. I mean, just whether it be a blue or white collar is irrelevant. There's high skilled or low skilled in both elements in my view. But what we have been seeing is that the desire for in some areas to actually get good staffing, people are coming in and saying and expecting the wage or the salary of a skilled worker off the bat, and that just makes it harder to find that resource. And it comes back to that CFO conversation we had a second ago about, well, what are people going to have to start realizing they might need to pay?
Great, thank you. And now switching perspectives completely onto the very specific question of what are the innovations happening in last mile delivery? Kevin, do you want to take that one?
I can take that. I think I think that there's a distinction that somewhat needs to be made here in terms of last mile delivery, because you're seeing a couple different trends. You're seeing a trend where a number of cases, the last mile delivery, especially in certain consumer companies, otherwise is being assumed by the companies themselves. I mean, we've seen in terms of investing in logistics and everything like that. I mean, I bring up Amazon just in terms of that, not just for consumer products, but for business products, where they went, for years and years, they used proxies, and now they're going in and absolutely, trying to do it themselves and succeeding. If you went through the pandemic and you didn't hear the sound of the Amazon delivery vehicle and their horrible backing up noise, you potentially were lucky or not. But and then the discussions talking about drones and otherwise, but a lot of it is that there's use of technology, there's utilization of alternate suppliers and sources, but there is a need to recognize now that there is a competitive advantage for the companies who have, whether they've re-altered their distribution networks and they figured out the way of, once again, a lot of regionalization in terms of how they operate, and how does that give them a competitive advantage? And does it cut it? Does mean that there's an exposure and inventory risk, but does it create a resilience when it comes to fuel costs? Does it create resilience when it comes to various weather disruptions and otherwise? And having, whether they manage the distribution themselves, or they have they use a technology base to essentially use a lot of different subcontractors, it can put them at a comparative advantage. And so, but that creates a scale disparity where, for a lot of companies, the smaller ones have to buy into these larger networks, or they find themselves at a disadvantage.
Great, thank you. Richard, for our last minute, what prediction do you have for last mile delivery?
Yeah, so I see different difference between business and consumer. So on the consumer, we're already seeing, or we have seen, difficulties associated with getting sufficient logistics providers. That is, as Kevin was just saying there, be that trucks delivering your Amazon packages. I think there's going to be more automation. So we're seeing lots of stuff happening associated with even the drones coming in. There's several companies now that are actually demonstrating drone delivery capabilities. In Milton Keynes, in the UK, they actually have these small little robots, look like large Roombas almost, which are driving around the city, delivering products. They've probably been pushed over, a few of them, but and they're actually delivering at people's door. I mean, and that's so I think on the consumer side of things, we're just going to see more of that, frankly, at some point. Again, that's, you know, hopefully it's going to be electricity, rechargeable, all that stuff. That will be, I think, blended with the other ways that the final mile is being delivered. With regards to in actual business to business, cross-docking is happening a lot now, but I think it has been for years, but I think there's going to be more and more of that. You're going to see pooling of deliveries in a geographic location which makes best sense. So you have one delivery to a factory, one delivery to a company with multiple products, just simply to especially, I mean, the fuel in Europe is insane. It's pretty horrific in the US as well, everywhere, frankly. But I see more of that. And I also see, I don't remember the name, but I have seen some of the logistics providers, and I think, Kevin, it's what you were saying, where the smaller guys can basically sign up to being a service provider for the big guys like the DHRs, etc., and they'll operate under that. So I think that's what I would see. Consumers, it's going to be more tech, kind of cool ways that stuff gets delivered, automated. Hopefully not everything gets kind of pushed over by people. Secondly, it's going to be cross-docking and finding ways to kind of consolidate packages and deliveries.
Great. Richard, thank you very much. Kevin, thank you very much. I appreciate both of you participating. We are at the top of the hour, and we've had such a great discussion. I can anticipate maybe supply chain part 2, but stay tuned because well, let's see what we come back with. But again, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our participants for tuning in, and also all the tremendous questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but if you do have any follow-up questions, please do not let us know, and hopefully we can schedule another session. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.